Hello! Happy New Year, everyone! 2025 sucked for a wide variety of reasons, and if this first week of January has been any indication, 2026 is gonna suck much, much worse. But at least it was a good reading year. We gotta have one thing going for us, right? Throughout the year of 2025, I read 84 books, and now I will treat you to the top 25 of them. Well, a few years ago, when I made a stronger commitment to reading as opposed to doom scrolling with my free time, and don't get me wrong, I still doom scroll way too much, I got into the habit of ranking and then writing short reviews for my favorite 25 books of the year. Having such a large number of slots to fill forces me to engage with nearly everything I read as a potential favorite, right? And so this is the fourth year of me writing a top 25. If it interests you guys, I can actually go back in the future and make retroactive top 25 videos for previous years as well. I have two primary rules. One, the first is that entire series get listed under one slot. The second is that any author can only appear once in the top 25. Both of these rules permit me and encourage me to include a wider diversity of works, as opposed to just reading one of my favorite authors again and again and again and again, right? Since I have been spending the last couple of weeks writing these reviews, I am mostly going to be drawing from them in delivering this video version of a top 25. I hope you'll forgive me, but having my thoughts all organized in one place will allow me to record, edit, and publish this video far, far faster than if I was just rambling about 25 different things for however many hours and I was forced to try to shorten that down into some manageable video length. By the way, one more thing. I have not made a formal announcement of this, but over the last few weeks, I have been soliciting questions for a 3,000 subscriber Q&A video. Considering I am just about to go over into the big 3K, that's probably going to be the next thing that I record. So if there is something that is burning in your heart of hearts, follow the link that will probably be in the description below. That will lead to a short survey that not only will let me keep all your questions in one place, but it will allow me to get to know you guys a little better. Anyway, on to the top 25. Number 25, Terrortome by GARTH MARENGHI. Our first entrant needs no introduction. After all, he is the best-selling writer to ever live. GARTH MARENGHI, author, dreamweaver, visionary, plus actor. Of course, he is also not real. He's a character invented by British comedian Matthew Holness, a satire of schlocky, egotistical horror writers in the Stephen King mold. He was introduced to the world at large in the 2004 television series GARTH MARENGHI's Dark Place, a show which claimed to be a long-lost, poorly made supernatural medical drama written, directed, and starring GARTH MARENGHI himself. Even though it only ran 6 episodes, it is probably pound for pound the funniest television show ever produced. Now, 20 years later, Holness has been treating us to a new series of hilarious horror satires written in character as GARTH MARENGHI. Terrortome is the first of these, a set of 3 linked novellas introducing us to sociopathic writer Nick Steen, a thinly failed self-insert for GARTH MARENGHI himself, in his spooky misadventures after making a pact with a demonic typewriter. I had a great time reading this, but I usually found myself reading Terrortome in small chunks, because the sheer density of jokes often tired me out. I also highly recommend the audiobook version, read by Matthew Holness himself in GARTH MARENGHI's Dry Deadpan. For Christmas, my dad bought me the 3rd of the GARTH MARENGHI books. Like, I guess he just went into a Barnes & Noble and he was like, my son likes GARTH MARENGHI. Number 24, The Inverted World by Christopher Priest. A year ago, we lost Christopher Priest, a luminary of British science fiction, not to be confused with the American comic book writer of the same name. In honor of him, I read his most acclaimed and influential work. The Inverted World depicts a highly regimented society that lives exclusively in a gargantuan, train-like megastructure. You can see it on the cover right here. Every day, thousands of workers must build fresh tracks to pull the city along inch by inch, or else all of humanity will encounter a horrible doom. We follow a young man who is determined to uncover the world's bizarre secrets as he moves up through the ranks of this society. He is eventually assigned to go on an expedition miles and miles away from the safety of the train, the first time in his life that he has ever been so far away from home. Anyone who is willing to acknowledge the world beyond the train will only do so in hushed, horrified tones. Turns out there's a reason for that. Because after you leave the train's radius, things get weird. Really, really weird. The inverted world is a taut, enthralling mystery with some of the most inventive speculative physics in all of science fiction. But the story is let down by an ending that is deeply stupid and literally doesn't make any sense whatsoever if you think about it for more than 8 seconds. But, you know, I promise you that the other 90% is really, really excellent. The next book I don't have a physical copy for. Believe it or not, I try to read everything I can from my local lending library. Easily half of everything I read in any year is just stuff I get from the library. I only buy books if the library doesn't have them. Even my library, which is a really good library, doesn't have all the weird stuff I want to read, right? So, moving on, number 23 is ding! We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. Shirley Jackson was a woman who never fit in. Her life in a sleepy New England college town, surrounded by people who simply did not understand her on a fundamental level, was an endless source of anxiety and trauma for her, culminating in poor health, drug abuse, and a relatively early death. By channeling these neuroses into her gothic fiction, she produced some of the finest horror writing of the 20th century. Only now, decades after her death, does she get the public acclaim that she always deserved. Her themes of mental illness and social alienation only prove more and more relevant to modern readers with each passing year. She is most known for The Haunting of Hill House, but this year I read her other famous novel, We Have Always Lived in the Castle. This novel is narrated by the precocious Mary Cat Blackwood, a macabre, magic-obsessed teenager who lives in a perpetual state of arrested development. A girl who might have loved Hot Topic and Tim Burton had she lived today. But alas, she does not. And she is therefore socially estranged from the normie townies who bully her on the regular. They hate her entire family, or at least what's left of it. 6 years ago, most of her family, including her parents, died in a mass arsenic poisoning. Mary Cat's older sister, one of the only survivors, was accused of the crime but ultimately beat the rap. The court of public opinion decided otherwise. We Have Always Lived in the Castle is the story of two sisters, mentally ill in distinct ways, who find themselves entrenched with their ailing uncle in their dilapidated mansion, feared and loathed by all the people around them. A distant cousin showing up on their doorstep one day in search of a supposed family treasure only makes things more complicated. But despite everything that happens, the sisters have each other. To paraphrase the words of Jake Sully, this family is a fortress. Castle. Number 22, Latro in the Mist by Gene Wolfe. This is a chunky volume. This is 2 books in one. Gene Wolfe is undoubtedly the master of subjectivity and narratorial unreliability in genre fiction. In all of his works, from his short stories to his greatest epics, you are forced to ask yourself again and again, what is going on here that the narrator is choosing not to tell me? While Wolfe's most famous unreliable protagonist is Severian, the self-serving torturer messiah of Book of the New Sun, this year I finally met a Wolfe protagonist who tries his hardest to tell the truth, but is nevertheless incapable of telling the story straight. Latro in the Mist is 300 meets 50 first dates, or you can just say 300 first dates. This ancient fantasy duology tells the story of Latro, a mercenary exploring Greece and the wider Mediterranean in the aftermath of the Greco-Persian Wars. Too bad that he has been cursed with retrograde and interrograde amnesia. Each day he must write down a memento-style chronicle of his picaresque adventures before the memories fade away. The one upside of Latro's curse is that he now has the unique ability to see and talk to Greece's many gods and spirits, but he is not Greek. Nor does he speak Greek very well, so he struggles at all times to understand who anybody is or really what is going on at all, but he still does rather well for himself regardless. While Latro and the Mist is probably easier to understand on a chapter-to-chapter basis than Book of the New Sun, it can be a fiendishly puzzling read without a deep well of historical and mythological knowledge. Sometimes I struggled, but whenever I recognized a deep-cut Herodotus reference, I felt like a really cool guy. And isn't that what's most important? There's also an Egyptian-themed Latro sequel written much later, but maybe I'll get to that some other time. Number 21, Masters of Doom. Ding! By David Kushner. Video games, like any other form of media, is fertile ground for thoughtful cultural exploration. But despite electronic gaming being well over 50 years old, I find intellectually stimulating analyses about gaming and its culture hard to come by. In my experience, most books and documentaries about video games are more concerned with celebrating and coddling the fragile feelings of capital G gamers than having anything meaningful or incisive to say. For that reason, I've long appreciated the work of Jason Schreier for his empathetic but hard-hitting journalism on the ups and downs of the gritty, frequently abusive interiors of the game industry. Since I'm out of Jason Schreier books to read, I finally got around to reading the grandfather of video game journalism, 2003's Masters of Doom, written by David Kushner. This is a rollicking account of the yin-yang partnership between edgelord genius designer John Romero and turbo-nerd wunderkind programmer John Cormac. By combining their opposing sensibilities and skill sets, the two Johns became the first rock stars of gaming. Their meteoric rise culminated in the slick, hyper-violent shooter Doom, in all caps, changing the face of video games in American culture for. However, the same differences that made these men such great partners were also doomed to split them apart. Masters of Doom is a gripping work of popular history thanks to Kushner's deft skill at capturing the emotional intricacies of these two very strange men while making the insular world of 90s software startup culture accessible to a wide audience. Number 20, Stations of the Tide, by Michael Swanwick. Or it might be Swanwick, I actually don't know. In the early 90s, Michael Swanwick 1-2 punched genre literature, writing definitive works of science fiction and fantasy in quick succession. Where's Iron Dragon? Ah! Behold. Here it is. One was The Iron Dragon's Daughter, a deconstructive fairy/cyberpunk nightmare with sentient dragon mecha and a delightfully amoral protagonist. The other is Stations of the Tide, a psychedelic post-colonial sci-fi noir that is equally indebted to the works of Shakespeare and Gene Wolfe. A nameless bureaucrat from an intergalactic empire travels to the water planet of Miranda, to try to quash illegal technological wizardry from the mysterious technomage Gregorian. While the bureaucrat pursues many leads, he mostly gets punked by said wizard again and again. Swanwick uses these noir trappings as a canvas to paint a gorgeously bizarre alien world, stuffing dozens and dozens of weird ideas within the book's somewhat short page count. Since the actual plot is rather scant, a reader might frequently ask, what is going on? I even found myself asking that in the book's closing chapters. That ambiguity around the novel's purpose and direction made the final few sentences immensely satisfying. These words revealed a twist that entirely redefined and recontextualized the rest of the novel, giving the seemingly aimless narrative a sleek, hidden shape. Stations of the Tide is an excellent companion read to Gene Wolfe's Fifth Head of Cerberus and Robert Silverberg's Downward to the Earth, and I highly recommend it to anyone who likes unusual literary science fiction. Next up is the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. This is the 1947 Random House edition, which, even though it doesn't have a flashy slipcover or anything, it might be literally one of the most gorgeous books I own. Look at that. This is the art that I used for the thumbnail, by the way. Omar Khayyam was a Persian scientist who lived nearly 1,000 years ago. His contributions to mathematics and astronomy were so genius that they are still in use today. He also had a pastime of writing poetry, 4-verse quatrains called Rubaiyat. 800 years later, an Englishman named Edward FitzGerald discovered these somewhat obscure Persian poems and elected to translate them into English. However, he went far beyond what is typically acceptable for a translation today. He curated the poems, rearranged their order into a narrative, and crafted a shockingly loose translation that was more concerned with capturing the soul of Omar Khayyam's original poems than their literal content. While many modern readers are nervous about translators who inject their own sensibilities into a translated work, FitzGerald's inventive but ultimately egoless translation resulted in one of the finest collections of poetry available in the English language. A true synthesis between the poetic genius of two very different men living 800 years apart. In the years since, other scholars have made far more direct translations of Khayyam's quatrains, but these literal renditions lose the airy soul that FitzGerald captured so effortlessly. The Rubaiyat takes a philosophic position radically opposed to most other great works of poetry, which is that over-philosophizing your life is foolish. After all, we only have one life to live, and we have no real conception of what happens after we die. So what's the point of getting all stressed out about metaphysics? Just enjoy fine food, booze, and nature with the people you love. While this might sound like mere hedonism, Omar Khayyam's sheer exuberance for life make his poetry nothing but life-affirming. It is the best work of poetry I read all year, and you can read the whole thing in an hour. The Rubaiyat's lust for life is encapsulated in its most famous quatrain. A book of verses underneath the bough, a jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou beside me singing in the wilderness. Oh, wilderness were paradise enow. Number 18. Inherit the Stars by James P. Hogan. I, like any reader of sci-fi with a good head on their shoulders, appreciate competency. Seeing intelligent people use the full extent of their capabilities to puzzle through scientific or moral conundrums in the far future is one of the great pleasures of science fiction. That's why late 20th century sci-fi like Rendezvous with Rama or Star Trek The Next Generation are so rewarding to visit again and again. It's also why, for example, Ridley Scott's Prometheus or New Trek are so excruciating to watch. I'm not some CinemaSins asshole who expects characters to always make the correct decision, but in my opinion, if I am watching science fiction about experts, I should not feel smarter than the gibbering idiots bumbling around on the screen. With that rant out of the way, Inherit the Stars is an ode to competency. This sci-fi mystery follows scientists from several fields, biology, physics, archaeology, and so forth, who are working in friendly rivalry to solve a thorny mystery. The corpse of a desiccated human spaceman has been found on the moon. The problem is carbon dating demonstrates that the body is well over 50,000 years old, predating the whole of human civilization as we know it by a country mile. And so, Earth's greatest scientists get to work. They rigorously apply their insights in the scientific method to the mysteries, uncovering twist after twist after twist, even if it means they have to throw out literally everything we know about mankind in order to find the mind-blowing truth. Inherit the Stars is a short but immensely gratifying thriller about knowledge. I wrote that in all caps. And I can especially recommend it to anybody who loves the reveals of space archaeology games like Heaven's Vault or Outer Wilds, which is, as we know, the literal greatest game of all time. Hogan wrote an initial trilogy and then several additional sequels over the course of his long career, but I hear that they have vastly diminishing returns, so I don't know if I'll ever get around to them. Number 17. Ding! All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy. Call me a basic literary bro, but I love everything I've read by Cormac McCarthy. Blood Meridian and The Road, despite their pitch black bleakness, form two of my most treasured reading experiences. I will admit I was too stupid to understand The Passenger and Stella Maris, but I'm not gonna hold that against them. Long live the thalidomide kid. So since I front-loaded all the difficult McCarthys, it was a strange experience to finally read his most mainstream accessible novel. It even got a bad Hollywood movie directed by Billy Bob Thornton and butchered by Harvey Weinstein. All the Pretty Horses is a coming-of-age western about an American teenager who, upon the loss of his ranch, chooses to jump on his horse and ride across the Mexican border in search of his fortune. McCarthy's remarkable talent for painting the subtle beauties of the wilderness is here in full force, unostentatiously capturing the lonely grasslands and magnificent storms of the North Mexican Llano. The interior lives of its teenage protagonists, just like the weather, are equal parts mundane and sublime. All the Pretty Horses lulls you into a sense of security with its plain-spoken characters and refreshingly direct prose, which makes the darker story elements introduced in the second half all the more shocking and affecting. This is an aggressively commonplace opinion, but I think this is an excellent work for anyone who wants to dip their toes into McCarthy's wider oeuvre. Number 16. Flight of Dragons. The Flight of Dragons by Peter Dickinson. The Last Unicorn, based off of the literary masterpiece by Peter S. Beagle, is maybe the single greatest fantasy film ever made. Rankin Bass's follow-up, The Flight of Dragons, might take second place. I'm not going to talk too much about the film because it's a topic that I plan to explore far more heavily in the future, but my obsession since high school with Flight of Dragons has led to a lifelong quest for its source material, a speculative evolution book by beloved British children's author Peter Dickinson. In this fictional non-fiction book, Dickinson examines the entire recorded history of dragons around the world. Using the facts he gleans from European legend, Chinese myth, and beyond, he asks us, how are dragons even possible? If we are to assume that all of these stories are rooted in some deeper truth, how can such a massive, heavy reptile possibly fly, let alone breathe fire? The Flight of Dragons is the end result, a textbook demonstrating a hypothetical biology for dragons. And shockingly enough, Dickinson is in fact able to conjure a complex but scientifically rigorous rationalization for how dragons could truly exist, while still maintaining their essential folkloric elements. While Dickinson's writing is clever and well-researched, the true star of the show is Wayne Anderson's art. His dreamy ethereal pencils and ink of Dickinson's dragons evoke an ancient romantic age. With this single work, he proves himself to be one of the greatest fantasy illustrators to ever live. Come on, look at this. Look at this. Look at this! It's so beautiful. Number 15 is ding! Vineland by Thomas Pynchon. Every year I tell myself, next year is the year that I really get into Thomas Pynchon. Pynchon is renowned for being one of the literary giants of the 20th century, with each of his often gargantuan novels making tidal waves throughout the wide world of books upon release. His 1973 postmodern World War II rocketry epic Gravity's Rainbow was simultaneously acclaimed as a modern masterpiece and one of the most lengthy, dense, challenging, but potentially rewarding reads in the English language. Literary critics held their breaths to see how he would follow up this magnum opus. After a hiatus of 17 years, the reclusive author finally returned to release his long-awaited follow-up, Vineland, a short, humorous novel about burned-out ex-hippies in Reagan-era California. What? That's it? The intelligentsia cried. At the time, Vineland was seen as a disappointment, a fleeting novel that couldn't live up to the lofty standards of Pynchon's earlier works. But now, with 30 years of distance and many more epic tomes from Pynchon in the vein of what the critics originally wanted, Vineland can now be appreciated for what it is. A laid-back, ludicrously funny, but nevertheless razor-sharp satire about the forgotten peoples of American society, and how young progressive idealism is worn down and compromised over time by the immovable reactionary ideologies that hold the levers of power. It ended up being the perfect source material for one of the best films of this year, Paul Thomas Anderson's stoner thriller, One Battle After Another. Even though One Battle wonderfully translated the core themes and dynamics of Vineland to a modern post-Chapo leftist context, its particulars are radically different, meaning that even if you've seen the movie, it is still worth going back to read Vineland for yourself. Like, Vineland has an extensive subplot about cyberpunk ninjas. This novel is all over the place and not really that much happens, but that is the entire point. It's a laugh-a-sentence read with a brain and a heart and a soul. Here's hoping that in 2026, I can finally get around to reading Mason and Dixon, or at the very least, Shadow Ticket, which I got the hardcover for. Number 14. Vinland Saga by Makoto Yukimura. This is a Lifetime Achievement Award for one of the best manga of this century. Makoto Yukimura's gritty Viking manga Vinland Saga, which finally ended earlier this year. And, you know, every time I say this year, I'm talking about 2025, you know, don't be in the comments like, actually it's 2026. You know, it's, come on, just don't do it. Don't do it, man. It's serialized for 20 straight years, and I have been reading it for 12 of those years. Over the manga's 29 volumes, Yukimura painted a rich, intricate portrayal of European life in the early Middle Ages to ultimately interrogate a single theme. If humans easily resort to violence to exert their will on others, is it possible to create a world or even a single society that is free from all forms of violence? While this is a common question about the human condition, Yukimura's creative masterstroke was presenting these inquiries against the milieu of the Viking Age, possibly the most violent period of human history. Is it possible to be an absolute pacifist in a world where brutality and slaughter reign supreme? I don't want to give too many spoilers about the final story arc, but as you can imagine, it finally lived up to the premise of the title. The retired swordsman Thorfinn, now committed to the ways of peace, has led a sizable group of Icelandic colonists to Vinland, or modern-day Newfoundland, to establish a utopian society. Too bad that indigenous people already live there. Can this idealistic project survive the notoriously ugly colonial conflict that has defined the last 1,000 years of North American history? Vinland Saga is a strenuously researched retelling of an actual Icelandic historical account, the Saga of the Greenlanders, with some of the best character development and philosophical development in any modern manga. Plus, it's cool as hell. The anime adaptation is just as excellent, although it will take a few more seasons to complete the whole story. Though he certainly deserves a long break after decades of work, Makoto Yukimura is already gearing up to begin his next project, a science fiction manga that returns to his authorial roots. If you haven't read Planetes, that's his first manga, and that's also pretty dang good. Number 13 is The Golden Key by George MacDonald. I read it in a Penguin Classics of all of George MacDonald's fairy tales from the library, but this is the Ballantine release of some of his fairy tale novellas. This year, me and my childhood friend had a club where we read the fairy tales of Scottish pastor and writer George MacDonald. MacDonald is frequently esteemed today as author of Phantastes, the first modern fantasy novel, as well as one of the primary literary heroes for C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. While he is also celebrated for his whimsical children's fantasies, such as The Princess and the Goblin. My ongoing pursuit to chart the history of fairy tales led me to read all of his short fiction as well. I could easily choose to commemorate his whole corpus on this list, since he didn't really write all that many stories. His whimsical moralistic fantasies like The Light Princess were an utter delight, and I could easily recommend them. However, I decided to elevate one of these stories above the rest. The Golden Key is an allegorical fairy tale novella about a boy and a girl. Can you imagine? The boy has a magic golden key, but not the lock that it opens. Uh-oh. So the two children set off on a complicated years-long quest to find the lock and its secret, ambiguously abstract treasures. Tolkien used to love the Golden Key, frequently citing it in his seminal essay on fairy stories as the exemplar of written fantasy. However, when a publisher tasked him to write an introduction to a reprint of the story decades later, he found that he had fallen out of love with it entirely, as well as with George MacDonald's work as a whole. He found it too allegorical, too preachy, too similar to the works of Clive Staples Lewis, who gleefully emulated MacDonald until the end of his writing career. Tolkien's new distaste for MacDonald inspired him to write his own improved fairy tale novella, Smith of Wootton Major. This was the only fantasy work that he completed in the last decade of his life, years and years after The Lord of the Rings. While I understand and sympathize with Tolkien's hatred of allegory, what draws me so strongly to The Golden Key is how it resists resists any easy interpretation. Don't get me wrong, the Golden Key is certainly allegorical, and considering MacDonald's faith in writing proclivities, you can certainly read Christian themes and motifs into the Golden Key. But unlike Narnia, the Christianity here is abstract and hard to decipher. The Golden Key presents a mysterious cosmological dreamscape filled with bizarre ancient characters and elliptical narrative threads. It feels more like the artwork of William Blake than any conventional narrative. It is a story that demands read upon reread to dissect its symbolic tapestry. So despite its short length, it will remain as one of the most haunting, affecting fantasy works I've ever read. Number 12. Ding! Drive Your Plows Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk. Olga Tokarczuk is arguably Poland's greatest living author, albeit one who is a constant source of controversy in her home country for being proudly progressive and anti-white nationalist. In 2018, she won the Nobel Prize for Literature on the heels of her magnum opus, The Books of Jacob. I actually do have Jacob right here. It's so heavy. That novel is a lengthy, difficult theological epic about a failed Jewish messiah in 18th century Poland, which is to say, exactly up my alley. However, since I know that it will be a vast undertaking, I opted to read her most popular and accessible novel first. Drive Your Plows is a deconstruction of the frozen European crime thriller. It's told from the point of view of Janina, an eccentric older woman, animal rights activist, and William Blake devotee who kinda investigates a series of murders in her sleepy Polish village on the Czech border. However, as a kooky unmarried woman, none of her endeavors are taken seriously by the society in which she lives, not by the police, her neighbors, or any of the prominent community figures. I think spending a whole novel living inside Janina's eccentric head might be frustrating to some people, but I found her to be a delight. In fact, I think she might be one of the great literary characters of the 21st century. Drive Your Plows is a short but gently absorbing novel about social alienation and quiet activism in the face of a world that tells you, again and again, that you simply do not matter. Sure, there is a mystery, but trying too hard to solve it defeats the purpose of what Olga Tokarczuk was going for. It's the sort of book whose narrative slowly uncoils itself like a serpent before biting your face off at the end. And then you're like, gee whiz, I really should have seen that coming. I mean, there's a damn snake right in front of me. I don't know if I'll get to the Books of Jacob in 2026 because I have too many thick tomes to tackle as is, but I'm excited to keep exploring Tokarczuk's work. 11. Ding! Tooth and Claw by Jo Walton. Jo Walton has been on my to-read list for years, since she is quietly one of the most prolific and esteemed authors in modern literary fantasy. So this year, I finally read her first standalone novel, 2003's Tooth and Claw. This is the definition of high-concept fantasy. What if you wrote Pride and Prejudice with dragons? Yes, this is a novel about estates and balls and forbidden interclass romance, but every single character is a dragon. It's genius when you think about it, really. The underlying tensions of Regency and Victorian novels, can I obtain enough wealth and status to secure my position in society, translates easily to ancient Drake clans and the complex inheritance laws around millennia-old dragon hordes. Thus, the dramas behind these 19th century novels can be humorously literalized. Dragons who fail to establish their station don't just find themselves on the receiving end of desolation and social ruin, they often find themselves devoured whole by bigger, wealthier dragons. We follow a clan of young dragons who, after the death of their patriarch, find themselves denied a proper inheritance in both gold and dragon flesh, thanks to a boorish, powerful brother-in-law. This inciting incident initiates a slew of subplots following different family members throughout their trials and traversals of dragon society. But like a good Dickens novel, all the threads tied together at the end with a neat little bow. Tooth and Claw is a fantasy of manners, genre literature that explores social dynamics and class structure rather than warfare and politics. A rich, undersung mine of predominantly woman-written fantasy that I want to explore more going forward. Finally, we're at the top 10. Number 10 is Kristin Lavransdottir by Sigrid Undset. This is a box set from Bantam Books. This is the original translation from like the 1920s or 30s, but I actually mostly ended up reading the contemporary translation from like 15 years ago because that one is far more accurate to the original prose. A century ago, Norwegian author Sigrid Undset won the Nobel Prize for Literature. She was only the third woman to ever receive this honor. While this award is given to authors for their entire bibliography rather than any singular work, the selection committee emphasized that they chose Undset for her powerful descriptions of northern life during the Middle Ages. That's all in quotes, by the way. Novels about late medieval Norway were Undset's bread and butter, but none had a larger impact on literature and Norwegian popular culture than her magnum opus of historical fiction, Kristin Lavransdatter. This trilogy of novels follows the titular Kristin, daughter of a noble family, from childhood to marriage to death in the rugged Norwegian countryside of the early 14th century. The first book is a romance of sorts. Although she is engaged to someone else, the young Kristin falls in love with a dashing but irresponsible knight who ends up claiming her maidenhood. Oh wait, did he forget to tell her that he's married already? With kids? While the lusty passions and public scandal of Kristin's private life would all wrap up neatly in a romantic novel, Sigrid Undset is coldly committed to realistically sketching the consequences of such an affair in a society built around complex bonds of trust and kinship, with aftershocks that last for decades and generations. But even though Kristin Lavransdatter is not a bubbly romance, it is not a tragedy either. It's simply a human life, with all the ups and downs, the joys and the sorrows that any regular person will endure. It's for that reason that critics still hold Kristin Lavransdatter to be the most realistic literary portrayal ever written about life in the Middle Ages, even 100 years after it was first published. Sure, there are rebellions and political intrigues in the background and occasional foreground, but the vast majority of the action is, just looking after your animals and then going to church sometimes. I think I would personally call Kristin Lavransdatter a historical slice of life melodrama. Sigrid Undset lulls you into a false sense of security by her lush descriptions of life in the countryside in the changing seasons, just so that she can sucker punch you with the most bug nuts, emotionally brutal soap opera shenanigans that she can devise, all while maintaining the immaculate realism of her world. Number 9. Ding! Letters from Father Christmas by J.R.R. Tolkien. It has been over 50 years since the death of John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, and 5 since the death of his son, champion, and posthumous editor Christopher. This seems like it would spell the end of the Tolkien industrial complex, especially as his works edge closer and closer to the public domain. Nevertheless, the powers that be managed to find new works ravaged from his papers to publish each and every year with steadily decreasing returns. Thanks to this cynicism of mine, I did not expect much from Letters from Father Christmas, a compilation of Christmas letters he wrote to his young children throughout the 1930s and 40s in character as, well, Father Christmas. So what? We're gonna monetize his fatherhood too? But I didn't expect this to be one of the most charming and extensive world-building exercises he ever crafted outside of his legendarium. Besides the extensive artwork and complex calligraphy that these letters required, Father Christmas and each of his friends have distinct handwriting styles. Tolkien steadily develops the lore behind these letters, from a buddy comedy between Father Christmas and a clumsy polar bear to a complex, ongoing saga filled with goblin wars, multiple writing systems, and an extensive cast of inexplicably Finnish characters. If you can't tell, the development of Father Christmas's world is directly correlative to that of Tolkien's legendarium, each new idea directly corresponding to one of his early Silmarillion rewrites. For example, one year the Red Gnomes help Father Christmas do battle against the goblins, and then the next year they suddenly want to be called elves, just like in Book of Lost Tales Part 1. This is a shockingly important work to understanding the growth of Tolkien's creativity, but the true appeal is just seeing how much this man, who is often stereotyped today as being stodgy stodgy and self-serious, loved his children to his very bones. Through the snapshots of these letters, you can trace their births, childhoods, stints at boarding school, and passage into adulthood, all told through the warm and gently humorous voice of Father Christmas. It makes the final letters, written in early World War II and addressed to the final daughter still living at home, all the more heartbreaking. It is the end of this rich Arctic world developed over years and years, the end of an enchanting childhood for the Tolkien children, and truly the end of the pre-modern world. How is Father Christmas supposed to deliver presents while London is being bombed by the Nazis? The magic drains from reality and only cold iron remains. That's the world we are left with. Number 8. Ding! The Bridge of San Luis Rey by Thornton Wilder. There is a point every year where I find myself pretty far behind in my yearly reading goals. I mean, I'm sorry, I just had to 100% Donkey Kong Bonanza. And Silk Song, and Death Stranding 2, and probably some other stuff. As you can imagine, being derelict in my reading pushes me to read shorter books or novellas until I can catch up. And so that's what led to me picking up Thornton Wilder's The Bridge of San Luis Rey, a work that I hadn't heard of previously. Despite its relative obscurity today, it won the 1928 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and was one of the best-selling novels of the Roaring Twenties. Although Thornton Wilder had a prolific literary career, most notably for writing acclaimed and also Pulitzer Prize-winning stage play Our Town, it was sales of San Luis Rey that single-handedly kept him housed and fed for the rest of his life. The Bridge of San Luis Rey takes place in colonial-era Peru. One morning, the titular rope bridge, as ancient as it is well traversed by thousands of people a year, unexpectedly collapses, dropping men, women, and children to a horrible death in the ravine below. A local monk becomes obsessed with this tragedy. Was this random misfortune an act of God? If so, was it God's punishment for the dead's collective sin? Or was it God spiriting his favorite children up to heaven all the faster? His years of research to find a link between these lost souls drives him to madness. 3 biographical accounts form the majority of the novel, introducing us intimately to each and every person who died that fateful day. As you can guess, none of them can easily be classified as good or evil people, forcing us to grapple with the potential meaninglessness of their deaths and make our own conclusions. If this truly was the design of Providence, then the divine design is truly murky indeed. Over the last century, the Bridge of San Luis Rey has only gained relevance in its echoes of the many senseless tragedies and mass deaths of the 20th and 21st centuries, by examining how we come to terms with shocking sudden loss. If you are a fan of HBO's The Leftovers, this book packs the same themes of grief and inevitable mortality into an effective 100-page package. Number 7. Inventing the Renaissance by Ada Palmer. Terra Ignota is my favorite speculative fiction series of the last decade. Ada Palmer's sprawling sci-fi series about the rumblings of armed conflict in a post-national future society that is supposedly free from the antiquated strictures of religion and gender, told from the perspective of an unreliable madman who narrates the whole affair in the style of a 17th century philosophical novel, is perhaps the most ambitious authorial debut I've ever read. Palmer fits more interesting concepts about history, society, and literature in a single novel than most other authors do through their entire bibliographies. For someone who has so many ideas about where humanity came from and where it is going, it shouldn't be surprising that Ada Palmer is a tenured historian by trade. Inventing the Renaissance is her first work of nonfiction since becoming an author, a massive popular history about the Italian Renaissance. Although the book is thick as hell, it's written in a breezy comedic style. This has a dual purpose: to make the absurdly complex politics of the Renaissance more digestible, and to underline Palmer's primary thesis, that there isn't a single correct way to understand the Renaissance. From the very inception of the word Renaissance, writers and historians have used the term as a cudgel to define their theories of history. Just what exactly is the Renaissance a rebirth of? Art, science, literature, political theory, secular humanism. Each of these framings artificially positions the Renaissance as a golden age for something or other, so that these scholars can make sweeping generalizations about the state of the modern world and the rest of human history. The problem is, framing the Renaissance in this way, or in any other way, really, forces those scholars to create a disingenuous portrait of life in 1400s Italy, minimizing some facts so that other facts can shine through. Most importantly, the Italians at the time didn't feel like they were really seeing a golden age of anything. For all of the cultural, scientific, and literary advancements that were being made at the time, Italy was ultimately a divided land wreaked by endless plague and warfare. To the average Italian caught between the power plays of scheming merchant families and corrupt popes and the Borgias and dozens of foreign kings, life in the Renaissance felt like hell on earth. But once again, that is merely one facet, one possible portrayal of a dynamic and endlessly fascinating time and place. Not only was inventing the Renaissance a lovely, humorous read that helps the reader fit together the complex jigsaw of this time period through its layered portraits of notable men and women who lived through it, but I also found it to be an excellent introduction to historiography as a whole. It teaches you how to evaluate any other history book you read for the writer's implicit and explicit biases and examine how their framing of any historical person or period is indicative of their wider worldview. Number 6. The Wolfe Hall Trilogy by Hilary Mantel. I don't think that Wolfe Hall's high presence on this list is too surprising. It is probably the single most adulated work of historical fiction in the 21st century, so I'm here to say, yeah, it's really that good. Hilary Mantel's achingly researched novels, the product of 15 years of intense labor, teleport you back to Tudor England under the reign of King Henry VIII, an uneasy peace after decades of rose-themed civil war. But all is not well. The king doesn't have a male heir, so he wants to get divorced. But the Pope isn't allowing him to get divorced. So what is the country to do? Well, a young go-getter named Thomas Cromwell might have a few ideas. Despite his lowly birth, he slowly rises through the ranks of the English court to become Henry's right-hand man thanks to his intelligence, compassion, and political savvy. Wolfe Hall is Mantel's reclamation of the historical Thomas Cromwell. Since he was Henry's fixer, and Henry was, well, a huge piece of shit, Cromwell has often been cast as a villain in the stories of many people, such as Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and so forth, who suffered and died due to Henry's cruelties and whims. Wolfe Hall convincingly recasts Cromwell as a, for the most part, noble statesman centuries ahead of his time who is caught time and again between doing what's best for England in a burgeoning modern world versus the capricious whims of the king who held absolute power over him. The story of Henry and his many wives has been told hundreds of times, but what makes Wolfe Hall so compelling is its lived-in and grounded portrayal of post-medieval politicking. Most works of this ilk, Game of Thrones is the most obnoxious example, will display politics as nothing more but grand speeches and cackling backstabs. While Wolfe Hall has more than its share of manipulations and shocking reversals, it's ultimately a series about how the political sausage is made, which, as it turns out, is usually mundanities like dinner with the French ambassador or asking a lady-in-waiting how the Queen's pregnancy is going. Despite the endless threat of torture and execution in Henry's England, this might be one of the coziest reads I've ever had, an immersive political slice of life that effortlessly demonstrates that commoners and kings of 500 years ago are no different from those who live today. The BBC miniseries starring Mark Rylance is also excellent and worth investigating. Alright, here we are. Top 5. I am so tired and my throat hurts so much, but we're gonna get to the end of this. I'm doing this for you. Yes, you! Number 5. Amygdalatropolis by B.R. Yeager. The infamous image board 4chan is nearing its 25th anniversary, and in that time it has undergone radical changes in its culture and in popular perceptions of said culture. From an early anime shitposting community directly modeled after Japanese social media, to a shocking yet misanthropically egalitarian wellspring of meme culture, to a beachhead for hacker-coded anti-authoritarian and anti-capitalist social protest, to the internet's festering nucleus of white supremacism in the early alt-right, to the home of QAnon, which collectively melted the brains of Fox News boomers everywhere, to a husk of its former self, rendered completely irrelevant by a wider culture that has, ironically, subsumed all of its edgy memes and talking points into the default mainstream discourse. But even though so much can be sociologically traced back to 15-year-old 4chan posts, no form of media has ever gotten Chan culture right. It's still like the old news report on the hacker known as 4chan, positioning these anons as the final boss of the internet when, I don't know man, it's mostly just dudes in their rooms getting into heated debates about anime girls. I'm of the belief that anyone of my millennial cohort who grew up on the internet generally fell into two predominant meme cultures. The LiveJournal, Tumblr, AO3 axis on one hand, and the something awful 4chan Reddit axis on the other. These tended to respectively correspond to female and male socialization, but it wasn't exclusive. Long story short, since I grew up more towards the second axis, I am intimately familiar with Chan culture, and I figure that the bizarre portrayal of said culture in modern media is because most of today's television writers and cultural intelligentsia are former Tumblr posters who wouldn't touch 4chan with a 20-foot pole. With that long prologue out of the way, at the start of the year, I read Amygdalatropolis, the debut novel of iconoclast horror writer B.R. Yeager. This book captures a young man's descent into depravity, social alienation, and inhumanity through his posts on an image board. To be clear, this fictional board is clearly not inspired by 4chan, but by one of its many darker spin-offs, such as the notorious 8chan. Communities created because the racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, harassment, hate speech, and so forth of their posters were too extreme even for 4chan. So this novel throws us into the head of a young man who is literally brain rotted, someone who has watched so many videos of human dismemberment in illegal pornography that he has become totally numb to all emotion or sensation. The book is primarily told through image board discourse between the anonymous posters in different threads, interspersed with vignettes about the protagonist and his ever-decaying humanity. While the violence and misanthropy of the book is viscerally disturbing, even gut-churning, what truly got under my skin was how well B.R. Yeager captured the voices of these internet denizens. I recognized their memes, their typing styles, and their callous disregard for human life from my own experiences around the internet going back 20 years. I had the stark realization that this novel wasn't just something that could happen, but something that is happening and continues to happen every single day. And frankly, something that will only get worse as more and more people become swallowed by the internet's darkest holes. That made this novel far scarier to me than anything with werewolves or vampires. Number 4. Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov. Since the day it was published, Vladimir Nabokov's controversial masterpiece Lolita has been a prime contender for greatest novel of the 20th century. In a widely publicized top 100 list on that topic from 1998, American publishing imprint Modern Library ranked Lolita near the very top, only behind the classics of James Joyce and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Literary critic Larry McCaffrey saw that list and said, "Boring! Get that dull-ass high school English shit out of here!" He then crafted his own list of the 20th century's 100 greatest novels, which drew from a wider, more dynamic pool of literature, including science fiction and the avant-garde. Even in that revised list, Lolita held the 10th highest rank. Number 1, a different Nabokov novel, his twistiest, weirdest, and most brain-bending of all, Pale Fire. Pale Fire takes the form of a 999-line poem about life and death by New England professor John Shade, who was murdered shortly after the completion of said poem under mysterious circumstances. After his death, the poem is compiled and heavily annotated by his neighbor, Charles Keenboat. Keenboat's extensive footnotes about this poem form the meat of this novel. The fundamental joke of Pale Fire is that Keenboat, the man who appoints himself as the overseer of John Shade's poetic legacy, is completely insane, and despite his supposed expertise on Shade, he completely misunderstands every single element of the original poem, misinterpreting them to be about his invasive, one-sided friendship with the dead poet, or about his own personal obsession with the ambiguously fictional Eastern European nation of Zembla. Each line from the poem, including, bizarrely, the phrase, "within cells interlinked," that they used to test the androids in Blade Runner 2049, is a leaping off point for Keenboat to make extensive tangents about his own personal life, all of which play out like Tim Robinson sketches. An astute reader will quickly figure out, based off of this unreliability, that Keenboat isn't quite who he claims to be, but Nabokov definitely keeps the novel ambiguous enough to permit dozens of interpretations of its hidden truths. I think it is really telling that Shade is a fictional identity constructed by Keenboat, and Keenboat is a fictional identity constructed by Shade, are both somewhat popular interpretations of the original text. But even if you don't go down the full rabbit hole of analyzing Pale Fire's infinite narrative possibilities, I found it to be an endlessly hilarious novel about the pinnacle of social horror. What if your legacy was dictated by the most cringe dude that you know? Number 5. The Alliance of Light by Janny Wurtz. This is just one of the books in a 5-book sub-series, but since they are so thick, I'm just going to use this one to stand for the rest. Janny Wurtz, probably the single most talented fantasist alive, spent over 2/3 of her life crafting her magnum opus of epic fantasy, The Wars of Light and Shadow, the tale of two magical brothers who are cursed to pursue the destruction of each other, spiraling into centuries of wizardry, warfare, and international politicking. After 50 long years building, plotting, and writing her immaculately structured saga, Janny Wurtz published the final book in the spring of 2024. Although this series fell into relative obscurity throughout the 21st century thanks to trend-chasing publishing houses refusing to give her the proper promotion she deserved, the long-awaited completion of Light and Shadow has led to a resurgence of interest in her work, promulgated by word-of-mouth exaltation by a new generation of readers, astounded by her magnificently ornate prose, understated but complex narrative design, and the most thoughtful, humanistic characterization in the entire history of genre literature. As you can guess, I am one of those new ecstatic fans. While I try to read series to their completion in any given year to make these year-end reviews cleaner, the sheer density of this series has forced me to digest it slowly over the last 2 years. And I am still not done. Fortunately, Light and Shadow is split into smaller story arcs that collectively offer their own developments, climaxes, and resolutions over the course of the larger saga. So in 2025, I read The Alliance of Light, the central pentology of her 11-book series and the narrative axis that the rest of the series revolves around. After the gut-churning bloodshed of the first few books, our shadowy protagonist Erathon tries to run away from the growing conflict, hoping to extinguish it entirely through his absence. But this only allows his authoritarian brother Lysair to unite a multitude of political, magical, and religious factions into the Alliance of Light, a global organization dedicated to justice and order, which is to say capital F fascism, that threatened to snuff out all the marginalized and vulnerable peoples that Erathon has sworn to protect. So he is forced to act, even if that means unmitigated suffering for himself and those that he loves. And that's ignoring the multiple encroaching forces on the verge of wiping out reality entirely, like the Lovecraftian ghost dragons. That doesn't seem very good. I want to give special praise to Peril's Gate, the centralmost book of the Alliance of Light. Even though it is the lengthiest book in the entire series, only 2 things happen in it. I do not mean that as an insult, but as a celebration of Janny Wurtz's bravado and narrative confidence. Our wounded, feverish hero is chased through the mountains in the dead of winter by a pack of men who will do anything to butcher him. In most books, this would be a single action sequence, but Janny Wurtz commits hundreds of pages to detailing this grueling affair, diving into the verisimilitude of this misery, which requires every single last physical and mental tool you have just to make it 1 more mile in the deadly snow. This is subsequently followed by a delightfully tortuous climax, which in turn is one of the most morally provocative and brutal gauntlets I have ever seen an author subject a character, and by extent, we as the readers to. Cry mercy! Going into 2026, I only have the final 3 books of Light and Shadow left, and I fully expect them to rank highly on next year's list. Number 2 is The Axe of Cain by Matthew Stover, consisting of 4 books. Heroes Die, which is often memed as like the ugliest cover in all of fantasy literature, but I don't think it's that bad. I think people are just hating. Blade of Tyshal, and the duology Cain Black Knife and Cain's Law. Cain is the greatest assassin in the fantasy realm of Ankara, a sardonic but brutal murderer who leaves dozens of slaughtered bodies in his wake. But Cain is just a construction. He is truly Harry Michelson, an aging actor from a dystopian, far future Earth. Years ago, our scientists discovered how to teleport people to a parallel world where magic and dragons are real. Ever since then, trained actors teleport to this world to Twitch stream their fantasy adventures for an eager, bloodthirsty audience back on Earth. Harry Michelson is the most popular actor of them all for the bloody, wisecracking antics of his Cain persona, but he has had enough. He is traumatized from his years of performative brutality, all for the sake of mere television ratings. He had little choice in the oppressive caste system that Earth has collapsed into, but he will do whatever it takes to find atonement, even if it means taking one last job. So begins The Axe of Cain by Matthew Woodring Stover, a quartet about Harry/Cain's chaotic and revolutionary misadventures fighting evil gods and oppressive bureaucracy through 2 equally bleak worlds. The first novel, Heroes Die, is a unique hybrid between cyberpunk and sword and sorcery, a tautly paced, hyper-violent action thriller that still keeps a thoughtful, humanistic head on its shoulders. Its blend of in-your-face badass excitement and casual philosophic depth make it the ultimate crowd pleaser. It would have been really easy for Matthew Stover to keep writing in this mode, churning out book after book of Cain's bloody swashbuckling adventures. If he did so, I honestly think Stover would probably be one of the best-selling fantasy authors alive. But he didn't, because that would be the exact same capitalist-mandated violent escapism that Cain himself is fighting to take down. Stover is too perceptive of an author to fall into this hypocrisy, so he's not going to write what will be popular, he is going to write what will be good. And so the second book, Blade of Tyshal, spits in the face of anyone who wanted more of the first book. It's a cruel examination of suffering and how it is perpetuated by systems of power. Several times I had to drop the book in shock, sometimes from moments of philosophical brilliance, other times from Stover's 25-year-old descriptions of techno-feudalist soullessness in late capitalist inhumanity, perfectly capturing elements of our current world. Blade of Tyshal engages with the entire scope of human literature, history, and philosophy to discuss these themes and to deconstruct the persona of Cain himself, leaving the man a broken husk for hundreds of pages. But this grueling, lengthy carousel of pain only means that Cain's growth and stunning rebirth are all the more satisfying. Stover stuffed every single idea he ever had into that messy, ambitious doorstopper. By the end of the narrative, Stover has so thoroughly blown up every aspect of this series that it surely must have been the end. And yet, it wasn't. The series concludes in a two-part finale. The first of these, Cain Blackknife, seems like a correction to the tone of the first book, a new adventure from wisecracking Cain in a new status quo, peppered with flashbacks to his first gory adventure. Then it ends on a cliffhanger. While the book is fun, it initially feels underwhelming, like 2 steps backward towards generic mainstream taste. But then you read the second part. Cain's Lies, well, it was the final book I read this year of 2025, and I still don't know how to properly discuss it. It turns out that the previous book was simple for a reason. Now, with all the pieces in place, Cain's Law is free to fully deconstruct the events of the entire series, exploring them through multiple metaphysical dimensions in several parallel timelines. This sort of maneuver, moving the mechanics of the plot to the realm of abstraction and metaphor, will always prove controversial, especially to a modern fantasy readership that increasingly demands hyper-literal world building and mechanical magic systems. Too bad they're wrong! I think this was a genius way for Stover to end the series. A man who once again gives his readers what they need rather than what they want. Cain's Law reminded me a lot of other hyper-controversial endings throughout fiction, all of which were brilliant, but I can't tell you which ones because that would spoil all of those works. Despite his talent, Stover has been soft retired for the last 15 years. Writing just doesn't pay for medical bills. However, there has been a renewed interest in his works from Star Wars fans. He is prized as the best writer to ever work in the expanded universe, and his novelization of Revenge of the Sith is, believe it or not, considered a literary masterpiece far better than Lucas's film. So fortunately, not only is he slowly re-entering the public eye, he is allegedly working on a sequel series to The Acts of Cain. I eagerly await anything he writes next. Okay, number 1. Golly! Can you guess what it is? If you've been paying attention, it could only be one thing. The Mabinogion Tetralogy by Evangeline Walton. Prince of Anoon, Children of Lear, The Song of Rhiannon, and The Island of the Mighty, formerly known as The Virgin and the Swine. It couldn't be anything other than this. Evangeline Walton's Mabinogion has easily held the top spot of this list since the day I first started reading the tetralogy back in the January of 2025. She had already been on my radar for several years thanks to the high esteem she was granted by the fantasy tastemakers of the 70s. However, the individual books of the series have been out of print since before I was even born, so it took me an age of scavenging and thrifting to assemble the full set. And I know my championing of Evangeline Walton has made her books even harder to find, so I'm sorry for that. I was lucky enough to find the 1970s editions with eye-popping art painted by David McCall Johnston and Bob Pepper. Even amongst other Ballantines, their covers are uniquely gorgeous. I have to say, my quest to find these books was worth it. Today, the Mabinogion refers to the wider compendium of Welsh legend that we still have today, including early Welsh variants of the King Arthur mythos. But if we're using the words in specific, it refers to the branches of the Mabinogi, 4 interlinking tales that form the core of Welsh myth. Ever since Lady Charlotte Guest poetically translated the Mabinogion into English during the 1840s, it has been a font of inspiration for Anglophone fantasy authors such as Kenneth Morris, John Cowper Powys, Alan Garner, Lloyd Alexander, and, somewhat indirectly, J.R.R. Tolkien. While these authors remixed the Mabinogion in various ways, Evangeline Walton chose to do a straight prose retelling of the 4 branches, expanding each of these 10 to 15 page stories to 200 to 300 page epics. While the mythological retelling is nothing new in terms of literature, Walton's work sings because she somehow manages to add dozens of new layers of of historic, religious, philosophical, and psychological depth in each of these novels without straying from any of the literal events of these ancient stories. Thus, these relatively short books become cauldrons of emotional and thematic resonance, bubbling with deeper meaning. And my god, I haven't even talked about her prose yet. Earlier this year, I read an essay by Ursula Le Guin about the best prose stylists to ever write in the realm of fantasy, and Evangeline Walton was the only other woman she included. Make of that what you will. Simultaneously ornate and soothing, Walton's writing swaddles you like a blanket, not only during its soft romances, but throughout the most horrifying events imaginable. Despite the light touch of her prose, Evangeline Walton is also able to capture human evil better than any of the so-called grimdark authors popular today. For example, her historical Viking novel Dark Runs the Road contains the single most disturbing paragraph I have ever read in fiction. I could gush about Walton for hours, and in fact, I have. But long story short is that Evangeline Walton is one of the most talented, multifaceted fantasy authors to ever live. But despite her immense talent, most of her work remains unpublished and out of print. Fortunately, renowned fantasy scholar Douglas A. Anderson is working on editing and publishing some of the lost works. But in the meantime, I can continue spreading the good word about Evangeline Walton's writing until she can be republished and placed on bookstore shelves where she truly belongs. I did it. I'm finally done. Watch this. Flight of dragons, soaring the purple light. Here's a paper airplane of my Evangeline Walton essay. Thank you to anyone who watched through this entire video, or even if you skimmed through it, you're cool too. I am exhausted from talking so much, but I am going to end on a quick little mini rant. BookTube, especially fantasy BookTube, is frequently criticized for talking about the same books over and over again. You know, having this relatively limited pool of like 20 series that get all of the discussions, maybe even less than that, frankly. And so every couple of months you'll have people responding to these micro dramas of like, why do fantasy booktubers only talk about the same books over and over again? And there's some like solid reasons, which I can't fault anyone for. You know, it's like you need to follow the algorithm to get clicks. It's part of a community and it feels good when everyone is reading the same things. But another justification, which I've seen time and time again, I find truly disturbing. The reason why this hyper limited section of books dominate all of the discourse is because they're the ones that are most popular, and by extension, they must be the ones that are the best. They're popular for a reason. I simply have to reject this because then it assumes the contraposition that anything that is not popular is not good. And I say, fuck that. There are so many good books in the world, and I hope I have the pleasure of reading even a fraction of them, even 1,000th of them before I die. My personal reading journey is not going to be limited by peer pressure or by algorithms. Jesus Christ, definitely not algorithms. Are you kidding me? And so my promise to you as a viewer, is that I am going to keep reading whatever the hell I want, and I hope that 90% of those books are really, really good, and I want to tell you about these books that are really, really good, and then maybe you'll pick them up and you'll think they're really, really good as well. And then both of our lives can be enriched for it, right? Already, I have so many interesting things lined up for 2026, and I hope you join me on that journey. The world sucks right now, but at least we have good books. Thank you, and I love you.